Now, moving on to the next section, we have first in line in a series of panel discussions today, and the first one is data strategy, deciphering data and unleashing its potential. So give me a moment to introduce all the panelists to you, and I request the panelists to come on stage once I announce your names. First, we have Mr. Ashish Gupta, Global Head of Data and Analytics at PerkinElmer, Inc. Can we have a round of applause for him? Our next panelist is Mr. Hari Saravanabhavan, Vice President, Global Analytics at Concentrix. Then we have with us Mr. Thomas Jacob Kollenkeril, Senior Director of Analytics at Biocon. We also have with us Mr. Deepanshu Malhotra, Senior Director, Head of Analytics and Data Engineering for Razorpay. Our next panelist is Ms. Meenal Ashtikar, India Head of Enterprise Data Services at State Street. Then we have Mr. Vijay Sivaram, CEO, Quest IT Staffing, Recruitment and Search at Quest Corp Limited. The next panelist is Mr. Krishnan Venkateshwaran, Chief Technology Officer at Titan Industries Limited. And now to moderate this panel discussion, may I request Mr. Hitesh Sethi, Director of Analytics and Business Advisory at Dun & Bradstreet India, to take the stage. Over to you, Hitesh.
Thank you, Kaustav. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I think from Bangalore standards, it's already noon, so should say good afternoon. In Bombay, we start the day early, but generally trade for the first hour and then go to office. Yeah, so that's some smart data for you. So when we look at data strategy, I think we are really talking about digital processes which are enabling data to be readily available. And one part of the topic which we'll cover with the panel would be about how we can use this digital data, how can we store it, how can we solve business use cases. So that's one piece which we'll try and cover. We have a good panel. We have users who are actually part of the industry where they've been using this data to transform many problems. Could be on the healthcare side, could be on the financial services side. We have companies who are enabling technology to handle this data efficiently. And we have analytics and data scientists who are actually working and modeling that data to bring out outcomes. I am, been part of this journey all through. I think there was a time where data was available but was in physical shapes and forms. We used to have huge processes running data entry, and then there were statistical processes to derive linearity, look at what the outcome is. And then finally, we had the gaps filled through collecting data from primary surveys. But now it is a lot of data which is available. And for us, when we do the planning, I think the first question we always ask is what is relevant? And if it is relevant, then the second question we ask is how can we use it? So let me start with that question first, maybe get Meenal into it. When we look at data, and the availability, how it's transformed, what are the three top things which come to your mind, both from an opportunity perspective and challenge perspective?
Great question. Thanks, Hitesh. And before I start, good morning everyone at Power of Data. And I hope you have a good time over here through the day. When we talk about data, right, there's always challenges, there's always opportunities also associated with it. But with a big enterprise, when, something like a State Street where I work, we've grown through, a lot of big enterprises would go through inorganic and organic growth. You would have acquisitions and you could have disparate kind of data that would come. So I think the topmost challenge would be how you can actually get your hands on all kinds of data that you have had over a period of time through different services and products about customers, about your employees, about your products, and actually making that like a cohesive landscape which you can then analyze and work on. So the first, I think, is just the landscape of how you're getting the data. Second one is how you're going to use that data, right? So there are different ways of doing insights, and there's one way where you know what you want to do, right? Where you have use cases probably. So what's relevant? That
right.
question comes, and that's a very I like to use this example where I say this is a very Sherlock Holmes kind of way of doing analytics, where you know that there's a murder and you're after a murderer, and you're sorting out the data saying, yeah, this is the kind of data that might be useful. Those are the clues to get to the murderer. So that's a very Sherlock Holmes kind of an approach to analytics. But there's another way where, you have the data and that's dark. It's a dark data. You don't know what insights you might get. And that's a Columbus way of doing analytics, right? Where you just get into the ocean of data and try to find the nuggets over there, and you might just stumble upon something. So an organization might have these two kind of approaches, and ideally should have both these approaches so that you actually use the data well. Challenge there would be, how do you bring these two concepts together, right? And how do you enable the technology behind it to support that kind of analytics as well? And thirdly, I think there's a lot of focus now on responsible analytics, right? Responsible AI. You're answerable to regulators, you're answerable, you should be compliant with standards and policies. With global organizations, you have the regulations also changing across different jurisdictions, so it's not just one, right? How do you share that data? How do you enable, multiple, I guess, entities that you have across the region to actually use that data over a time? So working along the overall regulatory and compliance landscape, the governance around it, that's the third challenge. And I think there are opportunities in all of these three.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think, width of data, the governance which comes in, the use cases from the business perspective, and interestingly, Hari, from a Levi's perspective, when you look at global supply chains, how things are moving today, we were in a trend where everything was globalized, both the sourcing as well as the entire supply chain, to now where increasingly we are seeing the supply chain is shrinking, localization coming up. How do you adapt, to an environment like this using data and analytics driven use cases?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Let me use not on. Is there a switch here? Oh, then you give me else. Yeah, I had heard long time back about data being the new oil. Today I learned that data is dope. But I'd like to offer another definition. Data is not just oil, it has become the soil now, right? It has become too foundational to probably everything we do, and in that sense, I would suggest that we actually gone to the second order or third order level in terms of using data. There was a time when collection itself was a primary challenge. I think we have more or less gone beyond that. Probably across the world, the extent may vary, but in Titan, for example, just to come back to your point about supply chains, I think our dependence on China in terms of input material for many of our products was exceeding 50%. And now we have brought it down to, in different contexts, as low as say 20%, 30%. Some remarkable transformation, especially in our watches and eye care business. So the dependence on external sources has significantly reduced, and our dependence on India-based sourcing has significantly increased. And obviously, the knowledge that industries provide, almost online, in terms of who we can get in touch with, who to speak with, and so on and so forth, has played a huge role in this, right? It's just simply easier to find out potential upstream partners and initiate conversations, and obviously be able to see their own track records as well, right? And so a process that might have taken probably weeks or months can actually be concluded the same evening or probably in a matter of days.
Sure. Yeah.
And DNB is one of the sources we certainly use, but there are others as well.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. I think, one of the open questions which I have is, when you look at planning and you look at data availability, you look at use case prioritization, all of these together, how do you prioritize, say, business use cases which you want to focus on to drive customer outcomes? Anyone, from the panel who would want to pick this up?
I can go first. First of all, good morning and good afternoon, depending on which part of the city you're from. In my mind, when you're looking at use cases, at the beginning of whatever you do, you should really have some sort of a perspective on what you want to do. The larger problem that you really want to solve as an organization, as an entity, and stuff like that. And from there, you really start all of your use cases, formulation, and work backwards, right? I'm also a firm believer that when you look at data, you can actually start organically and say, I can collect all the data, I can do whatever I want. But in a large organization, that's probably not the way it really works, right? You're out there to solve problems, you're out there to add value, and you really have to start from the right-hand side of the chart, which is, what are the problems I'm going to solve? What are the use cases that I really need to get in? To get that in motion, what is the kind of data that I require, right? You can always organically collect data, but data needs to be really put to use. And some of the terms that the industry today uses, for example, a data translator, right? An analytics translator. These are big roles that are really coming up for people to know that if I want to solve those use cases, how do I really interpret the data? It's not just about interpreting the insights. I mean, that really comes at a much, much later stage. How do you really interpret the data itself for it to become a very important component of your entire ecosystem, right? So I would think that the prioritization is really at a broader level. You know what problems you're solving, break that out into use cases, and really work backwards through the value chain, the midstream and the upstream, for you to really drive the right kind of results for an organization. That's the way probably I would look at it.
Sure. And just coming to you, from a business outcome perspective, how do you measure success? So, we prioritize, say, a use case, could be on the supply chain side, could be on the customer acquisition side. We've delivered outcomes. Is there a process through which you measure a successful outcome for an analytics program driven through data?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can do a lot of things with data. We can play around with data, generate our own insights, but it's no use if that's not getting adopted, right? So the adoption is the biggest thing around, whatever insights you generate, whatever you do with data. And how do you know whether it's getting adopted or not? So, so it might be as simple as, let's say we did some sourcing rationalization, across our various acquisitions that we have. We have vendors supplying us parts, different parts, maybe the same part to different companies, different acquisitions at different prices. So, we did all this analytics, we did sourcing rationalization, we figured out that, this same part is being sourced to our company, is being provided to our company at different prices. But then ultimately, what do we do with this data? We all know all of this, right? We give it to the users live in their own world. If they do not value the insights, there is no point of doing this.
Right.
So it is very important that whatever insights are being generated, you figure out the ROI around it.
Sure.
So we do it. Every insight that we generate or every new capability that we develop, there is this formal mechanism where we do the ROI calculation, which is, of course, we boast about it as well. So I would say that, that's the most critical thing that for us.
Sure. Okay.
So Hitesh, can I add to that? So Ashish, you mentioned about the ROI part of an analytics program, right? And I'm a big fan of experimentation. So if you're on that side of the analytics program where you're experimenting, right, every analytics program is a success because you've probably found one way of not doing analytics as well. So it really depends on what you are after and where you lie. So if you are from a research perspective, maybe you could just have an experiment which runs, may not give you necessarily an ROI, but you would still probably learn a lot about your data, and that's a success in itself. Right, so.
It is not to extend, but I also want to give everybody a slightly different perspective. When you look at data, today a lot of data that gets collected in an organization is unstructured, right? And when you get unstructured data into your model process and stuff like that, the ability to really convert that into benefit, into value is really a big task. And
Right.
organizations are really doing that well. I know earlier we were speaking about ESG being a big focus area. Today there is something called a trust score that a lot of organizations put out. What is a trust score? It's actually using NLP. You're really using all unstructured data to give it a quantifiable variable, and that becomes an ROI or a meaningful result that people are looking at, and they're able to relate to it, right? So I think, the industry is also coming through to say, what can I do with unstructured data? How do I really assign values
Right.
to it and really make that, a positive outcome from a benefit or an ROI perspective?
Sure.
Just another
Thank
thing
you.
that's coming
You
up.
had a point.
I'd like to offer an example on how we work. We run hundreds of campaigns every year. I hope at least several of you have received them and have responded positively, right? So they're all analytics driven, and we actually implemented a test and control mechanism into the campaign itself. And we get that audited by one of the big four once every 2 years, just to showcase across all divisions and to ourselves that the campaign algorithm is actually generating an uplift.
Sure.
And that's the attributable revenue which we report.
Sure. So I think an interesting point you made about structured, unstructured data, and in your environment, which is a highly specialized environment, driving healthcare outcomes very clearly. What role does structured, unstructured data play, both in the planning process and in use cases you've been delivering?
So for me in Biocon right now, and I don't know how many of you would know, but Biocon has predominantly been more of a B2B business than
Yes.
a B2C business.
Yes.
Right? So especially in India, we have certain products that we market ourselves. We're just probably pivoting into the B2C side with an acquisition of a company called Viatris beginning of this year. So the unstructured bit is not really in our purview right now. It continues to be the structured data that we are looking at. And very surprisingly, at least for me, when I came in, Biocon being one of the traditional Indian businesses, right? I was surprised with the volume of data that was available, right? So it was just that there's data sitting which is not being really leveraged. There's tons of data within the CRM SAP itself, but just to be able to get the right data to get the insights that are needed was where the struggle was. Just to add to the previous question that you were asking, for us, and we are in very early stages of our journey, the way we basically try to do is to ensure that our data strategy is related to the business strategy, right? At the end of it, that's the way to try and identify what are the ideal use cases that we want to go after, right? So it's not just saying, okay, I have data here, so let me use that data to try and identify something. No, is that in line with what the business is trying to achieve? If it is, then we'll try and see what we can do out of that data. So just as an example, if we have a challenge when it comes to the amount of effort that is going into the quality control process, right? How do I try and reduce the manual effort that goes into the QC process, thereby not just reducing headcount, but also ensuring that the overall compliance to the various regulatory authorities are managed more effectively, right? So that's the way we've always approached looking at use cases. But of course, ROI then becomes critical because analytics and data in general is a new concept within the organization. There are a lot of leaders who still believe that they've been in the industry for 35 years. There's nothing anything can give them which the data, for example, the trust that the data will be able to provide them what they really require, right? So then being able to not just at the end of the project, but right at the start to say, okay, this is the expected benefit for a particular project is where it starts, and then constantly ensuring that we are on track so that at least we have some part of the organization which gets convinced with the power of data.
Sure. Yeah. No, I completely get the ROI and driving it basis business outcomes aligned with business strategy. How do you convince business users, that who are used to using their gut, intuition to drive decision making, to actually start using data models and use data for decision making?
Well, Gus, good question, and thanks for allowing me to be here. I'm just going to add one point to a couple of points earlier and come to your question, is that I think as a leader, as a CEO or as a head of a business, etc., the first point is to be being data aware.
Sure.
That these data exists and that you know you could pull out data as such. Having a gut feeling is nothing but a, a combination of all the experiences that you have had. In other words, your own data set as an individual. So I think organizations and human beings as leaders today will always have the divergent effect of believing their gut feeling of the experience that they've had. I think what they need to see is, as long as they're data aware and they know that core of the company lies in certain data, they should leverage the insights that come from there to make those decisions along with their gut feeling. If they choose to choose only one side, there's a larger risk potential.
Sure.
But if they know that data is there and they've got the insights coming like you mentioned, and they know, okay, this will result in a particular outcome, at least this is what the data shows, but my gut says otherwise, then take a consolidated view and saying, okay, this is how I would see it. And I think that's how leaders are doing it today.
Sure.
They have that gut, they try to reinforce that with the data that comes in.
Sure. Yeah, no, interesting point you make about data awareness. I think that's the starting point for many of us, that whether we as data scientists as well as business users, are they aware of what data sources are available, and is there an alternative way of looking at things? I think that's a skill set in itself which drives the dimensions of data. Then there is the other part on the strategy, what for we are doing this, and once you define that, like you rightly said, from a business strategy perspective, then the how, the implementation part comes in, driving ROI, successful outcomes, in all of this, there is this huge resource allocation problem which is there. We have resources, plenty of them, but sometimes skill becomes an issue. Sometimes holding them across a program becomes an issue. How do you navigate these challenges? What do you do to keep the team motivated to drive business outcomes?
So, so the perspective that I have is very different from the rest of the panelists, because
Sure.
Razorpay is a very sort of a newer company than the others.
Right.
There was a comment that we are in the second and third stage, so we are going to that direction. So our challenges are very different, and something that it was new for me when I also got in, because my previous experiences in banking where a lot of these challenges do not really exist, so
Right.
a lot of it was alien. But I think if you want somebody to come in and make sense out of the data and generate outcomes, first we need to take care of their experience of working with data.
Sure.
So the two key parts that we tried to solve, and which is where we did a lot of things in the last 15 months at Razorpay, is to ensure that the data quality and the data exhaustiveness is taken care of. We rely a lot on the clickstream data, the API data, and the number of unique data, so Salesforce, Freshdesk, whatnot. And one of the initial effort was to put in some sort of a framework, some sort of a standard processes to ensure that the person who is going to consume the data is going to define how the data is going to get captured by the engineering. So that is the process we introduced, and that is working really well. So now the data quality is no longer a problem. Plus we also had to solve for the past thing. The next thing that the challenge that the team faced was on the tooling bit, because all these younger startups in the early stage, they are more likely to use the open source tech, which faces a lot of challenge in scaling up. So we have changed our entire stack to enterprise stacks. There are three things we onboarded. One is Databricks for the computation and the processing and manipulation. The other thing is a self-serving layer, which is also a BI layer called Looker. And the third is an anomaly detection tool, which can help us in business observability. So all these three things gives the team the right sort of tools.
Sure.
And the last part is the opportunities. Because obviously you are so new into this ecosystem and the payments ecosystem, just to define how the data can play a role.
Right.
Which is where our initial effort was to, and which is something that you also touched upon, is having a seat at the table. Which means that we are not thinking about the consumption at the end of the solution. We are there defining the goals for the company. which means that everything that we have created is aligned and then it will go into the consumption from engineering perspective. So everything is sort of planned well in advance. So these three things has helped improve the experience of the team. And obviously the challenges will come, but I think this is the major thing that we did last 1 year.
Sure, yeah.
And an interesting point that he was just making. So that's exactly one area where I don't think we do a great job yet, right? Being a traditional company, you have a certain requirement, or somebody decides, okay, I'm going to implement a laboratory information management system, right? Now these are process, and this is a highly regulated market, right? So anything and everything anybody does inside a lab has to get documented. Earlier it was being done on tons of paper, which needs to then be kept in cold storage forever. Now it's all getting digitalized.
Sure.
Now we come in after somebody's already started implementing the solution. We look at the final output, or once the implementation is done, then we are pulled in and basically told, okay, now make sense of the data that's coming out. How can we improve our performance? Then we suddenly realized, okay, 5 of the streams that I needed out of this data source hasn't been implemented, because probably there was a cost element or somebody didn't think that it was necessary.
Right.
Then suddenly you're sitting with data which is not complete, right? So then you're going back to the drawing board trying to get those data captured so that we can give the insights that are needed. So I think one very important aspect and in ensuring that not just the ROI but also making sure that your teams are motivated enough for the future is to ensure that right at the start, when some of these systems are being implemented, the right folks are involved. It shouldn't just be an IT related implementation, it also needs to be a data related implementation that basically happens.
Sure.
So I would like to add to that,
Yeah,
a fantastic point he's got there, right? So we tend to look at this analytics programs as technology and data program. There's one more dimension I think that we need to absolutely consider for success of any of these programs is the domain orientation or the business orientation, right? So the anatomy of any analytics engineer or a data analyst has to have that dimension with the business orientation. Otherwise, you would not just be, you would be doing a lot of stuff on technology, you would be doing a lot of data analysis, but how it really goes and impacts the life of, say, a salesperson or a marketing person or, any of the people who are actually consuming their data, unless you understand that, you would not get that satisfaction of what difference are you making in anybody's life, right, with the insights that you create.
Sure.
So when we talk about the skills, right, I think that's one of the important skills when we are talking about analytics is the business orientation and the domain orientation.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just going to mix your last part of the question on talent and the skills part as well, because that's core to what I do. Just to give you a hindsight, Quest is second largest private employer in the country. We are around 5 lakh employees. We onboard new employees around 20,000 every month for our customers. And in that, close to around 500 to 700 people every month come just from data engineering. And this is a trend that we've seen in the last 6 months to 12 months. And to the point of skills, etc. I think on your part of the question and mixing it with hers, comment is that there are 3 things that we need to keep in mind, and what I'm seeing in the market today when you hire 500, 700 data engineers every month. One, there is a sudden need for what I call, or what we call in the staffing side of the world, called the superhuman syndrome or the Superman syndrome. The hiring manager wants a guy who has got all the skills in one profile. And we try to identify that one person who's got X, A, B, C, D, E skill, has got all that stuff. And I think that is becoming a more common element in most of the demands that come out today, what I call as the Superman syndrome. The second thing is, there's also a huge amount of hiring manager fatigue that's happening, and I'm sure many in this room must be going through doing tons of interviews every other day and consistent. And as in the human resource world, it's called the halo effect and the horn effect. You keep meeting people, you start judging in the first 2 minutes of an interview. And you start realizing that no, he doesn't fit or she's great as such. And I think, so there's a huge amount of hiring manager fatigue that's also built into the process. Third, there's a fixation on laterals. Everything has to be done as of yesterday, therefore I need someone who can hit the job running today. And there becomes a very limited investment pool that comes onto developing a whole new set of talent through freshers. And unfortunately, academia is really not caught up with the amount of skill upgrades that's come in the market today. So to her point, when you get a resource to get to understand the business objectives, understand the domain, and have the skills to do it, it's a combination of what the organization wants to have that person execute or drive. What is the business objective that the person has to result? And I think that's where the resource itself feels empowered, saying that, okay, I know this industry now, I've picked up, I know what a laboratory needs, I know what a bank needs, and I know I've got the tools and the equipment to do it. I may not be perfect, I may not be the Superman, but I get there, and I think that drives that whole talent scoping of the industry.
Sure. No, thank you for that. Very interesting point, and one point I want to stay with. How do you do that, right? Today, we are running teams, we have business users, people who are data engineers, data scientists. How do you expose them to business outcomes? How do you train them, and anyone who's been successful in thinking like a salesperson who's sitting in front of a customer, wanting to close a deal, or from a marketing outcome perspective, or from a supply chain sustainability risk perspective, how do you do that?
So, at least the way I look at it, it's easier when it comes to sales, marketing, maybe even supply chain to a large extent. But when you look at the back end of the biopharma world, with your quality control, R&D, manufacturing, it becomes very technical. Right? And you will not find that Superman anywhere.
Right.
Just to take an example, so the way we basically operate, so there is a core team who basically has bits and pieces of understanding. There could be specific skill sets that you're looking at, so it could be a quants guy that you're looking at, or it could be somebody who understands a little bit of technology and a little bit of the science behind the world. But you will never find a guy who understands chemistry and biology at the same time, right? And we have 2 labs right next to each other which would be doing that.
Sure.
Or it could be one product development itself where you need chemistry and biology understanding. So that kind of skill set doesn't exist.
Sure.
So you need to bring the right skill sets together rather than identify the right person to basically be doing it. So ensuring that a project team has the right skill sets available, somebody who understands the business, so it could be somebody from the business itself, not from the data or analytics team, being a very integral and critical part of the overall group, I think is the only way it can be approached at the moment, at least.
Yeah, no, I get that. Sorry, let me rephrase this. I'm a supply chain manager. I'm looking at supply chain. My goal is to prevent disruption in the supply chain, ensure that availability is seamless. I'm a manufacturing guy. I want stable processes. I don't want quality defects in the product I'm manufacturing. Again, when I'm looking at a logistic guy saying availability at the retail store, sales guy says that I want to know my customer better and maybe much in advance to what he also wants. I want the latent demand known. Now, these are all simple business outcomes which they are driving, and one is the data which is available. The other is the use cases as a business strategy which we are driving. Somewhere I understand that the data scientist or the data engineer cannot do all of these. But how do they understand what actionable insight is required to drive successful business outcomes? Because I feel in my experience, that's been a huge issue, and I'll tell you how we've been doing it. One, you need a strong leader who's running. So I'm not a data scientist by profession. I'm a business user who've transformed and overseeing this process. It helps because I can see the team and the business cases from that lens. Second is that connection, we run in silos, but we don't need to. Enabling them to interact much more on the customer side, interact much more with the internal processes, maybe spend some time. And then over a period of time, invest in allowing them to make mistakes, train them with success. That's worked for me, not 100%, but these simple things, when I do it, I've realized that we are much better than what we would be if we'd be working individually in separate silos. Yeah, sorry, you were saying.
So yeah, we have, at Titan, we have developed a mechanism for this, and in fact, before the terms Agile and Scrum and stuff came into common parlance, we have had what we have called cross-functional teams for years, right? And these teams are actually charted with the outcomes similar to what you're talking of. And they are not the senior most folks. They are usually the mid-level operating folks who know rubber hits the road, what actually happens in retail. And those folks are empowered, and typically the head of the business, often the managing director, also sits in on their presentation. So visibility is assured. And in fact, that process has thrown up talent who has reached fairly senior levels in a company over the years. I mean, it's possible to pick them. So it's an intense process, yes. But I mean, if you take an analogy from the World Cup, there is no substitute to running, right?
Sure.
So
Yes.
we have just figured out how to run together.
Hitesh, I'll give
On
an
the same
example.
lines, right? On the same lines, so agile is there and it's being adopted in different ways and at different levels. But there's a concept of pod kind of a structure, right, where you have the representation of all of these functions within the same pod, and the pod delivers to the outcome. So the business teams or the functional teams get exposure to what happens on the technology side, and the technical people and the analyst actually gets to know what is really required, from a day-to-day perspective to make that happen. So I think that gives little bit of an exposure from the analytics or data engineers' perspective on what they are really working for.
Sure.
Correct?
Yeah. No, I think makes sense. So pod structure, what you said was, the senior leadership being more involved in driving these outcomes.
I just want to add.
And frankly, that just tends to reduce the barriers for the other counterpart as well.
Right.
Right? So there is an enhanced understanding all around of how business works as well as how technology works by the time the team makes its final presentation. So
Sure.
And I think
And
we're forgetting the
while,
term, the T profile, right? I think there has been that T profile concept for a long time. So I think could be something that, we could evaluate even today that's applicable and relevant.
Yeah.
So,
please.
so Hitesh, while of course you went a step further in terms of business processes, how does IT get aligned to those business processes, delivers those business processes? I'll give you a very simple example. Of course we are IT team. We get these requirements that, so these are those KPIs that we require, build these in those dashboards, for example, right? We did a whole lot of activities. Ultimately, to realize what the business does is they download that data into an Excel sheet, then they play around with that data, and then derive meaningful insights.
Right.
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 And my ask to the team was absolutely no. Do not just go after what the business asks.
Right.
You have to understand the business. You have to understand what is the requirement. So if they have to figure out those top suppliers, the supplier quality, for example. Now, why do they want us to do a report which just gives them the data and then they figure out, download that data into Excel sheets and figure out who's my top supplier, who has the best quality score, right? We can do it inherently. We have the data available, we have tools available. So technology we understand what's the capability of a tool. If we understand business as well, what the business wants, what they're looking for, we can marry all of it.
Sure.
Business will not understand what is the capability of the tool or the technology, right? Eventually they will, but they do not know at this time. But if we understand what the business wants, so each one of us, for the cross-functional teams that we talked about, so we ensure that everyone is functionally aligned.
Sure.
We have those digital bite sessions where, of course, they understand business, they talk about the business to others as well. So it is a key parameter for our entire team to be functionally aligned as well.
Sure. So quickly, I've been told that we have to wrap it up, so let me just quickly summarize what we covered so far. Diversity of data, we need to know what data sources are, and then we need to bring that together to drive successful business outcome. There is no superhuman which is available. We need to invest time in training resources, leadership and sponsorship, and their involvement is one of the critical factors, which drives outcomes. So now, 2 points, with which I want to close. One is this whole data governance, data privacy, which is with more data, more responsibility, especially if you are a consumer business, even more. So that is one piece, and how it impacts you in the strategies you deploy. And the second piece, which is related, today in India, suddenly, there are these aspects which are public infrastructure, and if you build up a business model which is, actually working on building that public infrastructure, you may soon realize that, this is something which we cannot do. So how do you adapt to these scenarios when it comes to, so for example, the prepaid card on the fintech side is one clear example of something which was in the gray area, but this has been discontinued recently. I was a user and, now I'm getting transitioned. So quickly, maybe, say 30 seconds to each, where we talk about data privacy and the role policy plays in defining your data strategy. Yeah, we can start with you, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So I think these are very important parameters, right? Data privacy and policies around it. Whenever you look at any resource, if you don't balance your resources well, you'll always have a problem, right? It's the same thing with data, in my opinion. If we don't balance it with the right kind of policies, the thought processes, we will always have a challenge. It will get misused. There will be a trust issue. And whether it is internal, whether it is at a large scale effect, is really going to have the same kind of impact,
sure.
right? So in my mind, it's something which is very, very critical from a governance standpoint. We've got to make sure that data is managed well. In fact, I'm on a panel next week, and the subject line is there something called too much data, right? And I don't have an answer to it, but I'm just saying that that's where people are already talking about how do you really manage your data well. Is there also almost a different concept to say, is there too much data coming to an organization or to a country or to an institution? How are you going to really manage that, right? So in my mind, yes, we need policies and procedures to manage it so that you really get the best out of the resource, just like any other natural resource.
No, I say that where is data? There's no data. Sustainable data is the question, actually. I don't know whether it's available sustainably. So just how do you build flexibility, from a business model perspective to look at these unanticipated changes, privacy laws, supply chain, sustainability,
Yeah, I think, so one is that you have to honor the law of the land. So in terms of data privacy, so you will have to honor those laws of land. That's something inbuilt. Of course, before this GDPRs came in, no one really cared. Now, of course, the amount of fine, the amount of, penalty that you have is pretty high. So, so that's one part of it, right? How do you honor the law of the land? But then the second part is that, within your organization, how you're ensuring that you have those guardrails set up, those governance boundaries set up. So I think it's a matter of prioritization.
Sure.
So if you're prioritizing, you'll set it right.
Sure. Anybody else who has...
Yeah, I think on the pharma side, we don't have a choice.
Sure.
It's regulated, so our policies are nothing compared to what the regulators come up with, right? So complying with it, if you can't, then you're not in business anymore. So it brings in that level of, the good part is that ensures that there is adequate attention for it from right from the CEO onwards. So it's a tightrope that you're walking at all times. Every single system that is being in use is CSV certified. So it has to get validated and approved by the regulatory authority. So there is no gray areas at all. You have to comply with whatever is being laid out.
So access control, data security, data design, where you build it in your product development by principle. I think, these are the things which, we've been doing. And I think the more your outcomes are driven by anonymized data where you cannot...
Not just that, I would go to the extent of saying, say for example, an instrument. It can be a simple instrument like a weighing scale, right? The weighing scale is a validated instrument, which basically means that if you are measuring 1 kilogram, you need to ensure that it is actually 1 kilogram, right? Especially these digital weighing scales. It might go through, as in the calibration might go wrong after 6 months of use. Right. So making sure that validation is happening every single month.
Sure.
And making sure that the fact that it has been validated is captured and the data is logged is very much part of the overall data policy.
So certification of the processes, having checks and balances in place.
Yep.
Sure. Any other viewpoint?
I've always said, sorry, please.
Sure. So I think governance has to be end-to-end across the entire data life cycle, right? So we talked about data minimalization. You talked about the regulations across and the compliance throughout the jurisdiction, right? We are also responsible to do away with that data. So data retention and archival and destruction is one of the key aspects, I think, from a governance perspective that we need to also think of and to use it responsibly. So I'll just add that one point.
Sure.
I think for me, I like to look at it, data privacy, data governance is like having good real estate, a good building. You need to know what comes in, what goes out, who comes in, who goes out, who has access, who doesn't have access, etc. Because as much, and it's an evolving thing, because the more you create stronger structures, stronger processes, there are people also trying to find out how to break those. And so cybersecurity and all this stuff are areas that, so it's to ensure that you have one strong real estate, strong infrastructure that allows complete control of what goes in, what goes out, and like he says, who decides what goes out, who decides what comes in, and making sure that keeps evolving. And I think that's critical to
Sure.
development.
How about Razorpay?
Yeah, so I think it's no different from pharma. We are highly regulated by
Right.
RBI. And a lot of the things are already covered.
If you could spend time on the product innovation part and how do you focus on data privacy there, for example. The guidelines, absolutely, you both are part of regulated industries and there is no choice there. There's no discretion, there's no gray area. But if, say, you're looking at a new dimension, a new need, and at the product development stage, what are the 2 things, 3 things you do which enables that to be sustainable, data privacy to be sustainable?
See, one of the example you gave about the card, prepaid card data, right? So there are certain things which are very clearly black from the government point of view. There are certain which are clearly gray. A lot of the time when you fall into that gray scenario that, okay, this data would it be applicable? Would we be able to consume in this manner in future? That is where we engage a lot with banks and government to try to understand what is
Sure.
the future roadmaps to that. But somehow, like, we'll also have to be nimble. For example, the situation that happened, because we also have corporate cards, now that there is a certain amount of data that we cannot use going forward. So you will also have to be nimble and change your product quickly so that you are compliant
Sure.
with that.
So stakeholder consultation is a key point there, getting to know them, what they're thinking, from that direction. Okay. So last 10 seconds, sorry.
Sure. So I would suggest that trust is really the new differentiating currency now that with DNB and other organizations democratizing data. So when it comes to our data, I mean, we have information about billions of our consumers, including PI and PI. So what we have done is to actually implement virtual IDs within our system so that need to know is absolutely controlled. So the analytics team, for example, doesn't need to know name, mobile number, and address. They're operating at aggregate level.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. There are enough and more
Yeah.
mechanisms.
So exclusion as a criteria, when you send it to processing, exclusion. So thank you very much. I think it was an interesting discussion, like all good discussions, a lot of open areas, a lot of questions, which still remain unanswered. But I think we are, in summary, part of a journey where data is available, tons of data. We need to make sense of it. We need to drive business outcomes. Credible, reliable partners for those data who can process, and maybe building outcomes which are validated at an industry level. One typical challenge which I feel, and I'll leave with this thought, is that in India I've seen each company has their own unique model to do the same problem which the other company is solving for also. And we have very, very less reliability on independent providers who have validated that model across multiple data points. So let's take ESG as an example. I'll go to a bank, they say, no, I have my own model, give me these 5 data points. However, that bank may have processed just 5,000 applications, right? That is not enough data, historical data, to train the model. So I think that's the other part of the challenge which we don't think of, and this is something which the Western counterparts do very well. So it's not just about the data, it's about how you're solving the problems. It's about greater alignment with the business, and at the same time, making it challenging enough with an executive sponsor for the analytics programs we are driving. Yeah. So with these few points, thank you very much for all of you. Thank you everyone for the patient hearing. Yeah. Thank you.
May I request all the panelists to just be on stage for just a little while longer. Thank you, Hitesh. Thank you to all our panelists. I think it was a wonderful, wonderful discussion that we had. I'm sure you all agree, right? Can we have another huge round of applause for everyone? Yeah. I'd just quickly like to call Mr. Vipul Oberoi, who's our Director of Marketing, CSR and Learning Solutions for Dun & Bradstreet India, to hand over some small mementos for all our panelists. Vipul Oberoi. So he wants a group picture of everyone. Can we all come together once and get a group picture? In the meantime, audience, are we having fun? I know we've come here to learn a lot, but we also need to have fun, right? Otherwise, it makes us dull. So do we all remember what data is? We don't? I just heard 3 voices saying dope, and that too very, very softly.